What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. We're back out in the garden today and we got some rain, so make sure you give a huge thumbs up for some rain. Thank you, thank you. The garden desperately needed it, but we got some rain. We're back out in the garden and I'm loving it because today we're going to be playing with our tomatoes. So we got a lot of tomatoes that are looking great. They're growing huge. We definitely need to start pruning them and staking them up. And so I thought I'd bring you guys along for a very comprehensive video on how we prune as well as stake our tomatoes. Now, as you guys know on this channel, I've always said this, what works for me might not work for you, but I want to show you what we do because we've had a lot of success in the past with this method specifically, and there's some things that you kind of need to know going into this before you just go out and do it in your garden. And so with that being said, let's get started because I think pruning your tomato plants and keeping them healthy is one of the biggest reasons that you're either going to succeed with growing tomatoes or just have moderate success. Tomatoes are pretty simple to grow, but it's the things that you do to your tomato plants when it comes to staking and pruning that takes them to the next level, allows them to stay that much more healthy and yield that much more fruit. So let's go. All right, so before we get started pruning and staking up our tomato plants, we first have to look at the three different types of tomatoes. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of the main two, which are a determinate and indeterminate, but there's actually a third, and that's a semi-determinate. Now, how we treat our tomatoes is really gonna dictate the type of tomato that we are growing, because the thing is that if you prune a determinate, you're gonna be decreasing your yields. If you fail to prune an indeterminate, you're gonna be ending up with a huge tangled up mess. So it's really important to know the distinctions between the three different varieties. And so I wanna talk about those right now. All right, so the first type of tomato is a determinate tomato. Now a determinate tomato, as the name implies, is very determined. The height of the tomato is determined. Typically they're gonna be about 4 to 5 feet tall at max height, but obviously that does vary. Typically that's right around the average though. And then they're gonna have a determined fruit yield. They're gonna form a lot of suckers. Those suckers are typically seen as bad things, but on determinate tomatoes, it's a very good thing because what we wanna do is have a lot of bushy growth that's then gonna form a lot of fruit and flowers, and then all of that fruit is gonna ripen at the same time. So the maturity date is very determined as well. And so you're essentially growing a tomato that is very calculated, it's very predictable, and it's very safe, especially if you're someone that's growing tomatoes for canning and production. You want to know, all right, I'm planting this plant and in 75 days, I'm gonna get a harvest. It's gonna be everything all at once. And so it's very predictable. Now, there's the second type of tomato, which is an indeterminate. Now that is, as the name implies, it's not determined, right? It's indeterminate, and it basically will keep growing as long as the season will allow. This is a tomato that gets much taller than it does get wide. It'll form a lot of suckers on the branches as it starts to grow, but not all of those suckers will have enough time to produce fruit and flowers because of the fact it'll continue to grow all season long. So the tomato plant will still produce suckers and flowers even into October if we still had weather for it. But there's no chance of the flowers actually forming fruit and the fruit ripening if it forms in October. And so it's a very long growing season tomato. It's very, it's reliant on you staking, doing a lot of kind of manicuring to it. And it also is typically gonna be a lot of your heirlooms. A lot of your heirloom tomatoes, I'd say probably 98% of them are an indeterminate. And that means they're just gonna continue to grow as long as the season allows. And the fruit will ripen at different stages because they flower at different stages. And then the third type is a combination of the two, the semi-determinate. This is a tomato that will continue to grow up until a kind of a determined height. It will stop, much like a determinate tomato does. But the fruit won't ripen all at the same time. And so it'll fruit and flower at varying times. So you get a little bit of the indeterminate traits with some of the determined height. And so those are the three different types of tomatoes. And so now that you know that, the really important thing is knowing how to treat them. All right, so now it's come time to pruning and staking. Now, this goes back to what I said in the beginning, which is that you need to know what you planted in your garden, because depending on what you planted will depend on the method of pruning and staking that you choose. So we're going to talk about the first two, which are really simple, which are the determinate and semi-determinate tomatoes. If you've planted a determinate or semi-determinate tomatoes, these stakes mean nothing to you. You do not want to use a stake like this because you're growing a bushy tomato. You're growing a shorter, stumpier tomato. At 4 to 5 feet tall, there's really no point in staking them up a 7-8 foot tall stake because they're not going to get that tall anyways. And we're not going to prune them to a single main growth stem like we'll talk about in a second. We're going to simply plant them and forget them. We're going to put them into a cage that's going to allow the branches to continue to form and form a really bushy plant. That bushy plant, like I said, is what's going to give you more flowers and more fruit later on. So a determinate and a semi-determinate tomato can be treated exactly the same. That's that you plant it in the ground and you simply forget it. You put a cage around it and you come back when those tomatoes are ripe. Maybe a couple waterings, maybe a couple fertilizings, but you do not do any pruning at all. And I repeat, any pruning. You don't do any pruning because the more pruning you do, the more suckers you take off. That's going to decrease the branches, that's going to decrease future fruit yields, and obviously what we're trying to do is trying to increase fruit yields. So you don't do any pruning at all. Now, the only type of maintenance you can do to a determinate and a semi-determinate are taking off the lower leaves that might be touching the soil. That's something that I always recommend doing because that's where blight actually forms. Blight is a soil-borne fungus. And so when it's found on the ground, usually it'll splash up on your leaves and you end up getting something like early blight or late blight. So you can come in here and you can remove these lower leaves. That's totally fine because these are not going to flower or fruit for you. That's just going to equal a healthier plant. Once you've pruned the plant up though, set it and forget it. So now we're going to talk about the third and the type of tomato that we're growing here, which is the indeterminate. These are the tomatoes that continue to grow all season long. They get nice and tall, so we want to give them a nice tall stake for them to climb up. Now, we have only indeterminates in our garden here. And so we have our stakes. These are T-posts. They're 8 foot tall T-posts. And I guess they're probably about 6.5 feet tall now because we pounded them in the ground. But we've given them a nice tall stake to climb up. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come in here and we're going to remove the suckers. I'm going to show you what those look like. We're also going to come in here and remove the lower leaves that are touching the ground. So let's get that done first, and then we can actually, once we get everything removed and cleaned up, then we can start staking. All right, so we're going to start pruning up and staking this, this giant crimson tomato here. So the first thing we always do is we start at soil level. You cannot possibly prune the tomato plant top down. It doesn't work that way. You always have to work bottom up. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start at the soil, and you're going to notice any type of growth down here that's starting to form, we pull that away. Then we look for anything that looks like a new tomato plant. Those usually form at the base. A lot of times the tomato plant will try to form like a fork, and so we want to remove that as well. So we're going to take that, and a lot of times if they're young and you catch them early, you can just pull them off. Then we're going to keep following that stem up. That's the main growth stem. We're going to find some branches. We're going to remove those, get those off the soil. Again, that's the highway for things like blight to climb. I've taken off one layer. I'll take off a second layer. I might take off more later, but I'm going to take off at least 2 layers of branches. That means the plant is up, probably at least, I'd say about 5-6 inches off the ground. Now you can take more off if you want. I find that right now this is probably fine. I might end up taking more off in a couple weeks, but for now, we're good. I'm going to keep going up though. I'm not going to remove any more stems, but I am going to look in between the stems to find the suckers. Those are the little plants that look like little itty bitty tomato plants. You can throw these as a little tip. You can throw these in water and they will root, and you can actually form a lot more tomato plants to give away or sell or plant. But we have a lot of tomato plants already in our garden, so we're simply going to remove them. We're going to keep going up the plant. We're systematic about this. Again, we work from the bottom up and we don't get distracted. Now we've come here to where there's a Y, and this is where you're given the choice. You can either choose one or the other. There's really no wrong way to do this. It formed a fork, and that fork has some flowers, and this fork here has slightly less flowers. What I will do typically is I will always prioritize the fork that has the flowers, because the fork that has the flowers is typically going to be your dominant growth point. A lot of times the tomato will kind of get confused. If it's very healthy, it'll form like a Y, and both will look like a main growth point. It's totally okay to say eeny, meeny, miny, mo, because you really can't go wrong. But because this is already forming flowers, it tells me it's a little bit stronger, a little bit healthier, a little more vigorous, and this probably has a better chance of being the main growth stem. And so we're gonna come in here and we're gonna prune this out as well. It's not really quite the same as a sucker because this actually was growing just as a main growth stem would. And so it's important to cut that out and not break it. So now we have a single main growth stem all the way up, a nice set of flowers here. It's been pruned off the ground, so it's nice and healthy. There's gonna be a lot of airflow to help dry out those leaves, reduce splashing, reduce the soil from splashing on the leaves and transmitting things like early blight, as well as late blight later on. It's also going to open up the flowers to things like pollinators, much more airflow, much more visibility to not only pollinators, but also the fruit's gonna ripen better and faster as well. And now we have a single main growth stem that we can tie up this stake here. All right, so now it is time to stake. Once we've pruned them up, we've gotten them to the point where they're nice and cleaned up, it's time that we stake them. So what we've done here, like I said, we've taken some T-posts and pounded those into the ground. You can also use furring strips. They make 8-foot tall furring strips. We cut the end on a 45-degree angle. We've used those for years and they're totally fine. They work great. It's just they start to rot over time, and these T-posts here, they're gonna be here for a long, long time, and they've been powder coated, so they're not gonna rust. So we really like to use these, but for an inexpensive option, for a couple bucks, you can use some T-posts as well. But basically you want something that's gonna be nice and tall that you can tie to. What we're gonna use to tie is this right here. This is elastic string, but we call it Fantastic Elastic. We actually sell it over at MIgardener.com, but it is currently sold out. So I will post to the next best option in the comments box or the description box down below to where you can get it. It's fantastic, and we've been using it for years. The reason why we want to use elastic string is because of the fact it has give. Using something with give is really important because when you tie up your tomato plants, you want to make sure that you don't tie them with something that doesn't have any give. A tight string will essentially girdle or choke the stem, and on a windy day, it doesn't give the tomato the ability to sway. And so what will happen is it will, over time, kind of cut into the stem of the tomato plant. And so what we're gonna tie them up with is something that is stretchy, that has give, and something that is nice and soft, but also something that won't get brittle in the sun. Fantastic Elastic, or elastic string, doesn't get brittle in the sun. It stays elastic the whole season, which is great. Now you can also use something like pantyhose. You can slice pantyhose into strips and use those as well. A lot of people have used those for years, but again, that can be a little bit expensive if you don't just have pantyhose laying around. But any type of material can be used as long as it's got give and it's nice and stretchy so the plant can grow, expand, and sway in the wind. So we're going to take a portion here of this Fantastic Elastic, and we're going to get about, I want to say, usually I like to go pretty big here because you can always have some slack. You can always have extra, but if you cut it too short, sometimes it's difficult to tie. I'm going to take my string, I'm going to come around the post, and I will always go underneath. This is really important. I will always go underneath a branch. And the reason why is because that branch is going to hold the weight of the tomato as it starts to grow. I also, when I stake my plants, I put my stake in. This is also really important. I put my stakes in a ways away from the plant. A lot of people like to put their stakes right next to the tomato plants. And the problem is that once the plants are growing, assuming nothing got damaged, it's fine. But when you put that stake in, you really don't know where those roots are. And in a lot of cases, you can actually damage the plant, if not completely killed it. I'm speaking from experience. So I like to put my stakes about 5 to 6 inches away from the plant. And when the plants get tall enough, I'll lean them into the stake. And then once they're growing up the stake, it's only, as they say, it's only up from there. So, so I go underneath a leaf node. That's gonna support the weight much, much better than if you put it just anywhere on the stem. And then I'm simply going to do an over-under knot. I just do 2 of them, and you're good to go. And so now this plant is staked. It is on a 45-degree angle, but as the plant starts to grow, we're going to be staking it and tying it up this stem here, and it's going to grow nice and straight. So now this plant has been pruned, and it's been properly maintained, and it's been properly staked. And it's that simple. A lot of people tend to overcomplicate this process and they buy all this fancy equipment, but really anybody can do this for even a couple bucks. And doing this is going to guarantee a much healthier plant. It's going to allow, like I said, the leaves to dry out. It's going to allow for better pollination. It's going to allow for more fruit to be set. And on top of that, it's going to hold a lot more fruit because we don't have all this fruit growing out in different parts of the plant. All the weight is on this single point here. So the weight is a lot more balanced, it's a lot more centered, and the center of gravity, since it's on a single post here, the weight is gonna be pulling down on the post rather than in one or two directions. And that's gonna help the plant to just fruit more in the long run as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to throw a like up there, subscribe if you haven't already. And I know that this is a lot of just kind of, we've talked a lot about this before in other videos, but I know a lot of you are new. And so if you're new to this channel, let me know in the comments box down below if you're new. We've had so many new people join this channel and join the community. And I thank you so much for that, because without you guys, we wouldn't have, a growing community. And so, so it's sometimes nice to kind of revisit some of these older videos that are still super important, really applicable to your garden, and sometimes can give you some reinforced information in case you forgot. So as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care, everyone.